session addressing the importance of societies at every stage of this journey toward inclusion, and particularly focusing on how to engage in self and field assessment to determine where to focus their efforts for impact, to establish goals and metrics, and to track progress. And she's going to offer some options for those assessments. So I am so thankful and so honored to turn the mic over to Dr. Kath. And Dr. Kath, it's all you. Take it away.
All right. Thank you guys so much. It is my pleasure to be here. Okay, so there we go. That's my first slide. That looks familiar. I'm happy to talk to you guys about evaluation of sexual harassment prevention efforts. You know, my background is in psychology, and evaluation is something that's very near and dear to my heart. So if you can come to the next slide. What I'd like to start out with is talking about some of the unique issues. So there are some specifics that are really unique to the evaluation of sexual harassment, prevention, interventions. And I'll start out by saying that these interventions can look any different way. So you may have interventions that are things like you're trying to diversify your editorial board, or you're trying to make sure that members feel more included in your organization. So, oh, I'm so sorry, my phone is ringing. Okay, so these interventions can be launched, and then you want to evaluate what's going on, but especially if they're around sexual harassment, there can be some really unique issues that may be worth discussing, why it's a little bit trickier sometimes to evaluate these. So go to the next one. Thank you. So participant motivation is something that can be a little bit tricky when you are dealing with interventions related to a topic like sexual harassment. It's not the same as something like Microsoft Excel training, where you do the training and people typically want to participate in the training because they're learning about how to use Microsoft Excel. So that's great. That's something that's directly relevant to them. Some people that are participating may not feel the relevance here. So that the what's in it for me can be a little bit of a tougher sell for participant motivation. All right, next slide, please. Another thing is that some of the outcomes can be really challenging. Typically, when we're doing some type of intervention, we would like to have people gain knowledge, for example. And sometimes with a situation like this, knowledge alone isn't enough. What you really want is to hit a critical mass and to have really the culture around issues like sexual harassment shift. So this can make it a little bit challenging as well. Next slide, please. There are some potential legal concerns around doing evaluation of sexual harassment prevention interventions. So these evaluation results can be considered discoverable in legal terms, which means that if there was ever a lawsuit against you, that these evaluation results could be called into that trial. Now, I think that you guys may have some opportunities to be really creative if you work together within this consortium to be able to maybe get some data that would be anonymous and difficult to parse out to any one specific organization. But I did think it was helpful to at least bring up the notion that there may be legal concerns with conducting evaluations. It's important to be aware of those. Next slide. The other challenge is that there's a dearth of research. So there's just not a lot of research that is out there on the evaluation of sexual harassment prevention efforts. So that makes it a challenge as well, because you'd like to be able to say, well, we know based on previous research that this works. And to some extent, we're all kind of out there trying to figure out what works. So I think it means that evaluation is especially important, but it means that there isn't as much to draw upon in terms of past efforts. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. This one is one of my favorites and least favorites at the same time, which is the backlash effect. So people often conduct interventions in organizations and they don't measure them at all. But when they do measure them, you expect that it's going to have either a zero effect or a positive effect. And sometimes what they found in sexual harassment evaluation work is that interventions sometimes make outcomes worse. So there have been a couple of studies where just introducing sexual harassment awareness training has made male participants endorse worse attitudes about sexual harassment. And so I think that you guys could probably see how this might be a concern, particularly in an area that's sensitive like sexual harassment. Okay, next slide, please. So I want to end this unique issues section with this idea, though, that if you don't evaluate, you can't really see how things went, and you can't see where to go from here. So I know that you guys are all participating because you would like to have some sense of progress. You would like to have some sense of moving forward. And I think evaluation is a really, really important thing to consider and to bake into your processes so that you really can see how things have gone and chart your course for the future to have maximum impact. All right, next slide. So the second section I want to talk about are some evaluation challenges. I have said before that most organizations launch interventions and they don't ever evaluate the effectiveness. They just do the program, they declare success, and they walk off with their arms in the air. And I think the reason that that happens is because it's a little bit scary to do evaluation. There's some challenges associated with this. So next slide, please. The biggest challenge is that you might get bad news. So if you can click one more time. Thank you. Acknowledging evaluation is scary, may help you and your team create the psychological safety that is needed to move forward. So evaluation feels like it's a bit of a risk, because what happens if you show that your intervention had no effect? What if you show that your intervention had actually a backlash effect? If you guys can really bake evaluation into the core of what you guys are doing, and acknowledge that it is scary to do it, but that it is important, then I think that can really go a long way to helping you design evaluation and make sure that you follow through on it. Okay, next slide, please. The other thing that is tough about evaluation is that it takes time and money to do evaluation. And that can be a tough sell to say, well, we would like to evaluate what we just did, when that time and that money could be spent moving forward. Well, okay, well, we could also just invest in the next program or something like that. But if you'll click to the next point, please. Evaluation helps you maximize your impact over time. So if you have leaders who are concerned or worried about the time and money that evaluation takes, I think what you really need to do is help support that long-term thinking and helping people understand that if you evaluate, that's what's going to help you be efficient and maximize your impact over time, which hopefully everybody should be on board with. All right, next slide, please. Something else that's tricky about evaluation is that the outcomes of the evaluation sometimes are unclear. So if we are doing an intervention to try to change the culture of our organization, that's really tricky. If you're doing something like you're trying to diversify the editorial board in a journal, just an example I gave earlier, that outcome's pretty clear. It might be really easy to measure that. But sometimes the outcomes are a little bit fuzzier, and that makes evaluation tough. But if you'll click to the next point, I'm going to be offering some ideas on how to identify appropriate outcomes. So never fear. At the heart of intervention evaluation is that intervention is about change. And so what you really want to think about is, what are the changes that you would like to see, and how do you measure those changes? So typical evaluation are just things like, did you enjoy the training? Did you think it was useful? Or do you think this was a worthwhile effort? But there are more sophisticated ways to get at information that'll really help you maximize your impact of the interventions that you guys are working on. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that I think about this is, what type of learning are you expecting might occur based on your intervention? And there are different ways to do this. So if you'll click the first category, the first one is knowledge. So click again. Sorry, there's a lot of clicking. You just want people to know and remember certain information. So at the lowest level of learning is just gain some knowledge. So it may be we have a policy about sexual harassment. We would like for you to know what our policy is about sexual harassment. So here it is. So one way that you might be able to test that is by just giving them a test afterwards and seeing that. So if you click the next, there we go, my little icon for, you can give people a test and measure their knowledge. So if you click the next category, that's attitudes. And it may be that in your intervention, you want to change people's attitudes or their beliefs about something. And so there it may be more appropriate to do kind of a broader survey to see what the attitudes in your organization are about a certain topic, such as sexual harassment. And the third category is skills. And here you want people to improve their skills in a certain area. Specifically related to sexual harassment, it may be something like bystander intervention. So if your group is having a conference and you would like for members to know how to intervene if they feel like there's a situation that could potentially be sexual harassment, that bystander intervention is a skill that you could try to help them learn. And a great way to evaluate and also embed this is by practice and seeing people practice these skills and measure their performance and see how they're doing. Okay, next slide. There are other broad categories of outcomes besides just learning. So the first one is behavior. And you may want to try to get a handle on what are the specific behaviors that you would like to see. So bystander intervention is one that I just mentioned. It may be reporting incidents to your organization's committee for these types of things or a particular officer. It may be that you would like to see your group create and enact some policy changes. So what are the behaviors that you would like to see as a result of this intervention? And the next category is these other metrics. So these may be organizational data that you already collect, the number of complaints. So time off of work is a little bit trickier for professional organizations, but things like attrition and turnover. So are you finding that certain groups of members may join, but they're less likely to remain in your organization? And then looking at that sort of your organization's culture and climate around these issues. Okay. So the last category here is evaluation design. And this is really about how do you plan for the evaluation itself. And my main point is that I want you to design with the end in mind. So I think sometimes people get a little bit hung up in I could do this, I could do that. But what I want you to do is think about what you're going to do with this information. So, okay, next slide, please. One really interesting question that I think is helpful to consider is whether you're measuring growth or whether you're measuring achievement. So once you have identified these outcomes, and I just walked you through a whole bunch of categories of outcomes to get the wheels spinning, to try to get you to think about what outcomes might be relevant in your situations, then you think about, do I want people to grow on this outcome, or do I just want them to achieve a certain level? So let me show you graphically what I mean by that. So on the next slide, if you have a growth focus, so I've got this pretend data that doesn't even have a y-axis, but you can see we've got 3 people. And the left-hand bar is the before, and the right-hand bar is the after. And we've got these 4 people who have had these before and after scores, so pre-test and post-test scores on whatever the outcome is. If you have a growth focus, and what you mean is you would like to see each individual grow from before to after. So if you click on the slide, what you see is that person 1 and 2 have that upward trajectory growth, and 3 does not. 4 does, lots of growth for person 4. So you can see that we have achieved our objectives for person 1, 2, and 4, but person 3 didn't have any growth as a result of our intervention. And so they would be considered a failure based on our identifying growth as a focus of our evaluation. So if you go to the next slide, if we're looking at a level of achievement is what we really want. And after the intervention, we would like for there to be some bar that has been met. If you click on the next slide, or the next animation, the red bar that's where we want people to come in at. So afterwards, are they at or above this red bar? Have they achieved this particular level? And what we see is that in this case, there's the same data, person 1 and 3 and 4 after, they're all above the line. So they all have been successful. Our intervention was successful in getting people to achieve this certain level. So person 2 did not quite meet the bar. So person 2 showed growth, as we saw from the last slide, but they didn't really achieve this particular level. So it's just interesting to think about those two ways of examining outcomes, especially if you're looking at before and after, and thinking about what it is that's most meaningful to you guys. All right, next slide, please. So this thinking with the end in mind, the focus is how will you use the evaluation results? So this can really influence the decisions that you make about your design, because evaluation takes time from you guys, and it also takes time from the people who have asked these, who have answered the questions or participated in your survey or whatever. So go to the next slide, please. So here's some possible uses for the results. So, and I kind of have them along this little windy pathway. So the first one is iteration and revision. It may be that you just want some feedback so that you can get a sense of how you might iterate. And so maybe it's just people that are within your own group and doing some focus groups or some discussions, some debriefing. So it can be very internal. Next, it could be promotion or marketing. So maybe you're trying to get some quotes to say, we have this training and we think it's really great. And here's some quotes from people who participated in it, some testimonials or things like that. Next is funding. So resources are often scarce. And if you'd like resources to be dedicated to this, you want to show that what you're doing works. And evaluation is a great and powerful tool to be able to advocate for maintaining or increasing your funding. Next is understanding the boundary conditions. So that sounds technical, but what I mean by that is for what situations or for which people do your interventions work, and for which ones do they not? So it's helpful to understand, is your intervention widely applicable? Is it widely efficacious? Or are there some misses in there and maybe you need to focus in on making sure you're reaching everybody? And lastly is research. So you can engage in this and have it be publishable research and contributing to that body of knowledge that I said was a little bit light. So for there, you want to make sure that you're collaborating with people who have experience with designing research studies, conducting research, and publishing those studies. All right. So my recommendation is to just take some time to think about it and really think about what do you want to use the evaluation for, and sit with that first before you start putting together your plan. I think that that's really important. Okay, next to last slide. Key takeaways. Number one, I want you to gear up, prepare yourself and prepare your team for the time and the money and the courage that is needed to engage in evaluation. It's very important to do, but it does take some dedication. So I think it's really helpful to start there. Number two is identifying what outcomes, what changes are you expecting, and how can you measure these things? And you're kind of painting a picture of what success looks like. And then lastly, you are keeping the end in mind. How are you going to use these results, and how can you make sure that the results that you get are going to help move your program forward and move your organization forward? So we'll end with something that I said earlier, which is that evaluation helps you maximize your impact over time. I think it's really powerful and really important. And so I think that there's a little bit of time for questions and answers, and I'd be happy to engage in that, but I'm a big fan of evaluation and I encourage it for everybody. Thank you.
Dr. Kath, thank you so much for this incredible information, for laying it out just so in a way that's so digestible and easy to understand. I know I took a lot away from that. We are waiting for some questions to come into the chat from the audience. Before we do that, I would love to hear your thoughts on, one of the things that you noted was acknowledging, one, what can come from your evaluation results and creating that psychological safety. I think that's really important. But then also acknowledging that this is going to be an undertaking. This is going to time and resources. One of the things that we know to be true about our consortium is we have a variety of societies that range in capacity, that range in size. Would love thinking about some of our smaller groups or even some of our societies that just don't have the ability to focus so much of their attention on evaluation. How can we make this bite-sized? What would you recommend for some of those groups to get started, knowing it's still really valuable for them, even if they're on a smaller size?
I think it's a great question because I don't want evaluation to be accessible only for the large and powerful groups. I think it can be important at a lot of different levels and a lot of different sizes groups. So one of the things that I would recommend is that a lot of the benefit of evaluation comes from just the thinking that I described. So I didn't hand out here's a guide and you just follow these steps. I'm really asking each individual organization to think about their own situation and to think through what does success look like? What information would be helpful for us to be able to move forward? And even though I showed graphs and evaluation can be very complex and very fancy, it also can be very simple. It can be identifying a small focus group that's representative of your organization and just asking them for 30 minutes of their time or an hour of their time to give you some feedback on some things. So it doesn't have to be a full, survey with lots of data analysis and that kind of stuff. It can just be, sitting and thinking about things and then asking some questions and trying to just get some more qualitative input. I think that can be enormously valuable, even though it isn't the big fancy mixed methods pre and post test kind of study.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And it sounds like there's a way to really think about your society's needs and adapt your evaluation tool to your context, which I think is really important. It relates to some of the questions that we're getting in the Q&A then. I have my thoughts on based on your last answer, but would love to pose this to you. Do you feel that, or do you think that there is a standard evaluation instrument for these interventions that societies should be thinking about? Are there commonalities across these interventions, or is it something that can be really designed to the outcomes for your society in mind, or the outcomes to your initiative?
I kind of have an in-between answer to that. On the whole, I like it when evaluations are really tailored to the situation. I think it gives it the best chance of being applicable to the needs of each individual group. That said, I also love the idea of sharing best practices, sharing what has worked for organizations, because anytime somebody has figured something out and another group could borrow it and use that and adapt it, I think it just makes it easier for everybody else.
And sharing best practices and learning from the community is a big focus of the consortium, so I appreciate that as well. Another question that we got in, and it sounds like you've spoken a little bit to this, but this idea of some societies facing kind of the idea that the perfect can be the enemy of the good, especially when it comes to evaluations. And societies can get hung up on having a really good plan, and without that really good plan, we can kind of keep kicking things down the road. What are your thoughts on brainstorming a few metrics, going for it and revising over time versus having to have that kind of perfect metric at the beginning before getting into it?
It's such a good question because it's something that I wrestle with personally. So it's easy for me to say, oh yeah, just go for it and just, iterate and make it happen. I think about, but if I am not tapping all of the people that I want to have provide input, then am I getting a skewed view and I'm pointed in the wrong direction? So I really understand, and these are analytical people, right? Like we're probably all fairly adept in thinking about things in complex ways. So I think that's why I like this idea of really sitting and thinking through some of these things first and talking about them, but not getting stuck in that phase. So it is really helpful to think if we're going to we can't do a full member survey because it's out of the scope of what we can manage, but we would like to pull together a focus group. Let's identify which parts of our membership do we want to make sure get a voice. So just being thoughtful about that and then doing the best that you can. So I think it's about kind of getting 75, 80% of the way there in terms of your thinking and then going for it. So again, it's that in between. Don't just anything is great. Do a little thinking, do a little homework, but don't get caught up in it's got to be perfect. Perfect is the enemy of the good is absolutely applicable here.
Awesome, thank you. A little bit more of kind of a tactical specific question, but you framed kind of two outcomes in mind, the achievement focus and the growth focus. And I think for both of these, but certainly I think much more applicable probably to the achievement focus is how it would seem to assume that you have some type of benchmark to judge based on. Is that possible for groups that, like, if you don't have a benchmark, how do you create that outcome in mind? What would you say to that?
That's a tough question. And the probably most realistic answer is that you have to guess. We don't have research that says people should be at this level. So it's, but it's an informed guess. It should be a thoughtful guess. And I think that's why I really designed this presentation to be focused on getting people to think broadly and deeply about the issue of evaluation and what are they going for. And if you're trying to set a benchmark and you don't really know what it should be, that might be kind of tough. So maybe you design a study that helps you just measure where are we, what's the baseline, and maybe then we set the achievement, focus bar at, we'd like to improve that by 10%, 20%, something like that. But it's very idiosyncratic. And it really just involves a lot of thought and discussion and logic. It just comes down to connecting it to the strategies in your organization, what's your DEI vision, and trying to make sure that it aligns there. But there's no magic formula to doing these things. It really is just a lot of conversations and decision making.
Of course. Switching gears a little bit, you noted at the beginning that knowing that evaluation can lead to negative results or kind of a bad picture of what things can be true, and acknowledging that can create that psychological safety. But it can also, even those results can potentially lead to some backlash from members, from leadership. And so two questions for you. In advance of the results, just even acknowledging that this could be bad, could be potentially some backlash from leadership and saying, okay, well, we don't want to do it then, right? So any thoughts on addressing that? And then on the flip side, when you do get those results that could create that backlash, how do you then deal with it then? So it's kind of a before and an after.
Yeah.
Would love to hear.
Yeah, these are very thoughtful questions. I would say that in terms of preparing people, I don't know if I would necessarily say, hey, this might not only not work, it might make things worse. That might be a little bit too much information. But it depends on how, what is the level of psychological safety that you have within the group, and can you say these things out loud and really talk about them? I also think that typically people identify a number of different outcomes, and that it may be rare that you're going to have no effect or backlash effect on everything. So I think it's fair to warn people that it may not be perfect the first time, and just maybe leave it vague like that. And then if you find out that there is this backlash effect and it made things worse, it's, disappointing and could really take the wind out of the sails. But that's why I'm really trying to encourage this long-term focus, and that evaluation helps you maximize impact over time. We all know that efforts to reduce sexual harassment, DEI efforts, all these kinds of things, this isn't we worked on it for 5 years and we solved the problem and we walk away. This is going to be a continued, sustained effort over time. Evaluation helps to keep you more focused on that path, and that growth could be nonlinear. It's likely to be. So I think, helping people brace for that and keep that focus way out and on the horizon is really helpful.
Absolutely. I think especially in DEI work, it's often stated that if the work isn't hard, you're not doing the right work.
Right.
And I think to the other point is if you have that backlash, those are also results, right? That's
Mhm.
telling of where your community is
Yeah.
based on just acknowledge or just evaluating
Yeah.
where you are in a quantitative way.
Yeah. And it's so much better to know that than to stick your head in the sand and continue to do harm to your organization without ever looking. So there's just so much power in that I think it's you have to get past the emotional part of it. Is it's it's scary, it's disappointing, it can feel like a real step backwards, but it really is important.
Awesome. Well, on that point, Dr. Kath, I think we will go ahead and conclude this session, but thank you so much for your insights, for your expertise, for just giving our societies and our members just so much to think about and to really apply to their situations. So thank you again, really appreciate it. We're honored to have you with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure. The questions were great, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys.